I awoke to darkness, as I had every morning for more years than I cared to count. The familiar weight of damp air pressed against my chest, a constant companion in this stone tomb that had become my home. My eyes opened slowly, reluctantly, to the same view that greeted me day after day. The cracked ceiling of my cell, barely visible in the dim light that struggled through the narrow slit of a window high above. Rolling onto my side, I felt the coarse straw of my pallet scratch against my cheek. The mattress had long since lost any semblance of comfort, compressed by the weight of my body and the passage of time. I drew a deep breath, tasting the musty air that hung heavy with the scent of mold and stone. The Bastille had its own distinct smell, ancient and unyielding, like time itself had been trapped within these walls alongside its prisoners. Another day, I whispered to myself, my voice raspy from disuse. How many times had I spoken those words? Thousands, perhaps. The sound barely carried beyond my lips, swallowed by the thick stone walls that surrounded me. I pushed myself upright, wincing at the familiar ache in my joints. My body had grown old here, betraying me with each passing year. The cold of the stone floor seeped through the thin soles of my worn shoes as I stood, sending a shiver up my spine. I hadn't always been this fragile creature, hunched and weathered. Once I had stood tall, proud even, but that was before the sealed letter, before the midnight arrest, before the gates of the Bastille had closed behind me with a finality that still echoed in my nightmares. The faint light that filtered through my window told me it was morning, though what hour exactly, I couldn't say. Time moved differently in the Bastille, stretching, contracting, bending around the rhythm of guard changes and meager meals. I shuffled to the window, standing on tiptoe to peer through the narrow opening. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that promised rain. Even the heavens seemed to press down upon Paris today. A distant sound caught my attention, the clanking of keys, the heavy tread of boots on stone. The guards were making their morning rounds. I stepped back from the window, my hand instinctively reaching for the small wooden cross I kept hidden in a crack in the wall. Not out of any particular devotion to God that had abandoned me long ago, but as a talisman, a small piece of the outside world that had somehow found its way into my cell. The sounds grew louder, echoing down the corridor outside my door. I could distinguish the voices now. Dupont, the younger guard with the perpetual scowl, and Renard, the older one whose lined face occasionally softened when he thought no one was looking. They were talking, their words muffled but their tone clear enough. There was an edge to their voices today, a tension I hadn't heard before. I moved to the small wooden table that, along with my bed and a crude chamber pot, constituted the entirety of my furnishings. On it sat a tin cup and plate, both empty, waiting for the morning's meager rations. My fingers traced the countless scratches on the table's surface, marks I had made to count the days, until the days became too numerous and the exercise too painful. Water dripped somewhere in my cell, a steady rhythm that had become so familiar I only noticed it when it occasionally stopped. The sound echoed softly, a liquid metronome marking time in this timeless place. I followed the sound to a corner where moisture seeped through a crack in the wall, forming a small puddle on the floor. The stones of the Bastille were always damp, as if the building itself wept for those trapped within its embrace. The lock on my door rattled and I straightened instinctively. Old habits died hard even here. The door creaked open, and Renard's weathered face appeared in the gap. "Bonjour, monsieur," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Your breakfast." He entered, carrying a tray with a small loaf of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a cup of what passed for coffee in the Bastille. A bitter, watery brew that bore little resemblance to the aromatic drink I vaguely remembered from my life before. "Thank you," I murmured, the words of gratitude automatic after all these years. I had learned early on that small courtesies could make the difference between a guard who ignored your existence and one who made your life a particular kind of hell. Renard set the tray down on the table but didn't immediately turn to leave as he usually did. Instead, he lingered, his eyes darting to the door and back to me. "There's talk in the city," he said, his voice low. "Unrest. The people are hungry." I nodded slowly, unsure why he was sharing this with me. News from outside rarely penetrated these walls, and when it did, it was never from the guards. "The king?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Renard shook his head slightly, blind to it all, or perhaps just unwilling to see. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "There are those who say change is coming." Before I could respond, a voice called from the corridor, "Renard, stop gossiping with the prisoners." Renard's face closed off, the brief moment of connection severed. "Eat your breakfast," he said, his voice returning to its usual gruffness. "It's all you'll get until midday." With that, he was gone, the door clanging shut behind him, the lock turning with a solid thunk that reverberated through my body. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, turning his words over in my mind. Unrest, change. What did it mean for those of us forgotten behind these walls? I moved to the table and sat down, breaking off a piece of the bread. It was stale, as always, but not moldy today. A small mercy. As I chewed, I gazed around my cell, taking in the familiar stones, each one etched into my memory. The walls were thick, designed to muffle cries and obscure secrets, but perhaps not thick enough to keep out the tide of change if what Renard said was true. Outside my window, I could hear the faint sounds of Paris awakening, the distant call of vendors, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A tension in the air perhaps, or a subtle shift in the usual rhythms of the city. I sipped the bitter coffee, grimacing at the taste but grateful for its warmth. My mind drifted, as it often did, to the life I had left behind. Faces that had once been sharp and clear in my memory had blurred with time. My wife's smile, my daughter's eyes. Were they still out there? Did they still remember the man who had been taken from them in the dead of night? A sudden commotion in the corridor snapped me back to the present. Raised voices, the sound of running feet, unusual for the normally regimented routine of the Bastille. I rose from my chair, drawn to the door by curiosity. Pressing my ear against the rough wood, doubled the guard at the gate. Someone was saying, the words floating to me in fragments. Crowd gathering. I stepped back, my heart beating a little faster. In all my years here, I had never heard the guards sound so concerned. What was happening beyond these walls? What storm was brewing in the streets of Paris? I returned to the window, straining to see what little I could of the world outside. The sky had darkened further, the clouds hanging low and heavy, a perfect mirror to the atmosphere that seemed to be building within the Bastille itself. As I stood there watching, a single raindrop struck the stone sill, followed by another and another. The heavens had opened and rain began to fall on Paris, a gentle patter that would soon become a downpour. But it wasn't just rain coming to the city today. I could feel it in the air, in the unusual behavior of the guards, in Renard's whispered words. Something was changing, and for the first time in years I felt a flicker of something I had thought long extinguished: hope. I pressed my fingers against the cold stone of the wall, feeling the dampness seep into my skin. The Bastille had stood for centuries, a symbol of the king's power and the state's authority. It had withstood sieges and revolts, weathered countless storms, both literal and figurative. But even the strongest walls could fall, given enough time and pressure. As the rain fell harder outside, I returned to my bed, sitting on the edge of the thin mattress. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady drumming of water against stone, to the unusual movements in the corridor, to the distant sounds of a city growing restless. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, but perhaps tomorrow would be different. Perhaps tomorrow the tide of change that Renard spoke of would reach even here, to the forgotten cells of the Bastille. I lay back on my pallet, feeling the rough straw beneath me, and waited for whatever the day would bring. I sat on the edge of my crude bed, watching a spider weave its web in the corner of my cell. There was a certain peace in observing its methodical work, the delicate strands, forming patterns that caught the sparse light filtering through my window. The spider had more freedom than I did. I thought bitterly, it could at least create something of its own design. The morning had passed slowly, as all mornings did in the Bastille. I had paced my cell, 8 steps from wall to wall, 6 steps across, until my legs ached. I had traced the cracks in the stone with my fingertips, finding new patterns in their familiar paths. I had listened to the sounds of the prison, the distant clanging of metal, the occasional shout, the shuffle of feet in the corridor. My stomach growled, reminding me that midday must be approaching. The meager breakfast I'd received at dawn had long since been consumed, leaving me with the familiar hollow feeling that never quite left me these days. I pressed a hand against my stomach, feeling the prominence of my ribs beneath my threadbare shirt. Once, I had been a man of substantial presence. Now, I was whittled down to bone and sinew, a shadow of my former self. The quality of light in my cell had changed, the dim morning glow giving way to a slightly brighter illumination that told me the sun had reached its zenith. My internal clock, honed by years of confinement, rarely failed me. Soon, I knew, the midday meal would arrive, another brief moment of human contact in the endless solitude of my days. As if summoned by my thoughts, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Not the familiar tread of Renard or the quick, impatient steps of Dupont, but a heavier, more deliberate gait. I straightened my posture instinctively, an old habit from my days as a gentleman. Even here, in this forsaken place, some vestiges of my former life remained. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Metal scraped against metal as keys jangled, followed by the grinding of the lock. The door swung open with a creak that set my teeth on edge, revealing a figure I didn't immediately recognize. He was a broad man, with shoulders that nearly filled the doorway and hands like hammers. His face was partially obscured by a patchy beard, but I could see the hardness in his eyes, the flat, emotionless gaze of a man who had seen too much suffering to be moved by it anymore. "Your meal," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble that matched his appearance. He carried a tray with a chunk of bread darker than usual, a small wedge of cheese, and a cup of what appeared to be wine rather than the usual watered-down broth. I stood, bowing my head slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Days could pass without me speaking a word, and each time I broke my silence, it felt like disturbing a tomb. The guard, jailer, I corrected myself mentally, for that was surely his role, placed the tray on my small table with surprising care. He didn't leave immediately, which was unusual. Instead, he stood there, his gaze moving around my cell, as if seeing it for the first time. "You've been here long," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Years," I replied, not knowing the exact count anymore. "Many years," he grunted, a sound that might have been sympathy, or merely acknowledgement. "Better than some, worse than others," he said, gesturing vaguely at my accommodations. It was true. My cell, while far from luxurious, was one of the better ones in the Bastille. I had a window, however small. I had a table and a bed, crude though they were. Some prisoners had nothing but straw on a stone floor and darkness so complete, they forgot what light looked like. "I have no complaints," I said, though it was a lie. I had many complaints, but voicing them would serve no purpose except perhaps to cost me what small comforts I did have. The jailer's eyes settled on me, assessing. "You were somebody once," he said. Again, not a question. Before, I felt a tightness in my chest at his words. Yes, I had been somebody once. A man with a name, a family, a position in society. A man who walked freely under the sun, who dined at fine tables, who held his wife in his arms at night, a man who existed beyond these walls. We all were, I said softly. The jailer reached for the cup on the tray and to my surprise held it out to me. Wine, he said. Real wine, not the piss they usually serve. I took the cup, careful not to let our fingers touch. The smell of it reached me, sour and strong, but undeniably wine. My mouth watered at the scent, a luxury I had almost forgotten. A special occasion, I asked, raising the cup slightly. The jailer's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Of sorts, he said. He glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. Paris is restless today. I took a small sip of the wine, savoring the sharp taste, so different from the watery concoctions I usually received. So I've heard, I said, remembering Renard's words from earlier. Unrest, they say. The jailer nodded. More than unrest, the people are hungry. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. The baker's wife doesn't bake enough bread, they say. I understood the reference immediately. The baker's wife, Marie Antoinette, the queen. The contempt in his voice when he spoke of her was unmistakable. And the king, I asked, pushing my luck. Information was as valuable as the wine in my cup, perhaps more so. The jailer spat on the floor, a gesture that spoke volumes. Blind, he said, deaf, living in his palace while Paris starves. He looked at me directly. Things can't go on like this. I took another sip of wine, feeling its warmth spread through me. What will happen? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The jailer shrugged his massive shoulders. Who can say? But something's coming. You can feel it in the air like before a storm. As if to emphasize his words, a distant rumble of thunder sounded, so faint I might have imagined it. But the jailer heard it too, his head turning slightly toward the window. Storm's coming, he said, and I wasn't sure if he meant the weather or something else entirely. He stepped back toward the door, his brief moment of openness closing like a shutter. Eat, he said, his voice returning to its gruff command. Who knows when you'll eat again? With that cryptic statement, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in the small space. I stood there, the cup of wine still in my hand, his words ringing in my ears. Who knows when you'll eat again? What did that mean? I moved to the table and sat down, breaking off a piece of the bread. It was dark and dense, but fresher than what I usually received. The cheese, too, seemed of better quality. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, washing it down with small sips of the wine. If this was to be my last decent meal for a while, as the jailer seemed to suggest, I would make it last. As I ate, I listened more carefully to the sounds outside my window. The usual bustle of Paris seemed different somehow, louder, more chaotic, and underneath it all a tension that hadn't been there before, like the taut string of a violin about to snap. The thunder rumbled again, closer this time. The storm was approaching, both literally and figuratively. I finished my meal and moved to the window, standing on tiptoe to peer out at the slice of sky visible from my vantage point. Dark clouds had gathered, obliterating the brief midday brightness. As I watched, a bolt of lightning split the sky, followed seconds later by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Bastille. I stepped back from the window, my heart beating a little faster. The storm outside mirrored the storm brewing within me, a mixture of fear and something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, perhaps, or simply the awareness that change was coming, for better or worse. I returned to my bed, sitting on the edge of the thin mattress. The wine had left a pleasant warmth in my belly, but my mind was clear, sharper than it had been in months. Something was happening in Paris, something that had the guards on edge, that had prompted an unfamiliar jailer to bring me wine and warnings. The rain began to fall, pattering against the stone outside my window. I closed my eyes, listening to its rhythm, trying to hear beneath it to the sounds of the city. Were there shouts, the marching of feet, the rumble of discontent that the jailer had spoken of? I couldn't be sure, but as the rain fell harder and the thunder growled overhead, I felt a strange certainty growing within me. The storm had come to Paris, and not just the one that drenched the city in rain. A different storm, one that had been building for years, fed by hunger and injustice, and the vast gulf between those who had everything and those who had nothing. And somehow I knew that storm would reach even here, to the forgotten cells of the Bastille. I just didn't know what it would mean for those of us trapped within these walls. As lightning flashed again, illuminating my cell in a brief harsh light, I wondered if I would live to see the world that emerged when the storm had passed. I sat on the edge of my bed, my back against the cold stone wall, listening. The Bastille was never truly silent. Even in the deepest hours of night, it breathed with the collective sighs of its captives. But during these mid-morning hours, when the guards were fewer and their attention divided, the voices of my fellow prisoners rose like ghosts through the thick walls. Today, I found myself more attuned to these sounds than usual. Perhaps it was Renard's whispered words about unrest in the city. Or perhaps it was simply that after years of solitude, I hungered for connection, even the phantom kind that came through stone and mortar. I closed my eyes, focusing on the sounds. Directly above me, pacing footsteps, 7 steps one way, pause, 7 steps back. I had counted them so many times, I could feel the rhythm in my bones. That would be the man they called the Comte. Though whether he was truly nobility or simply mad, I couldn't say. He had been here longer than I had, his footsteps marking time like a metronome. From somewhere to my left, a different sound emerged, a low melodic humming that gradually formed into words, a song, old and melancholy, about a lover lost at sea. The voice belonged to Michel, a former sailor arrested for sedition after speaking against the king's naval policies. His voice, though weathered by age and confinement, still carried the salt and wind of the ocean in its timbre. Le vent souffle sur la mer, mon amour ne reviendra pas. The wind blows over the sea, my love will not return. I found myself mouthing the words, familiar after hearing them so many times. Michel sang this song often, especially on days when the rain came. Did the water remind him of the sea he would likely never see again? Or was it simply that the sound of rainfall provided cover for his voice, making the guards less likely to punish him for the small act of defiance that was his song? A sudden cough erupted from the cell to my right, followed by a string of muttered curses. That would be Durand, the printer whose pamphlets had offended someone powerful enough to have him locked away. His cough had worsened over the winter months, a wet, rattling thing that made me wince each time I heard it. Silence, old man, a gruff voice called out, not a guard, but another prisoner. Some of us are trying to think. Think, Durand retorted, his voice hoarse. What good has thinking ever done any of us in here? Their bickering was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. These unseen men, whose faces I had never glimpsed, had become as known to me as my own reflection, perhaps more so, as mirrors were not among the luxuries afforded to Bastille prisoners. I rose from my bed and moved to the wall where Durand's cell lay beyond, placing my palm against the damp stone. It was cool to the touch, almost soothing. I wondered if he was doing the same on his side, if our hands might be aligned, separated only by feet of unyielding rock. How fare you today, Durand? I called softly, my mouth close to the wall. That cough sounds no better. There was a pause, then the sound of movement. It comes and goes, he replied, his voice closer now, like hope in this place. I smiled despite myself. Durand had a way with words. It was what had landed him here after all. Have you heard anything from the guards? There seems to be unusual activity today. Nothing clear, he said, but Jean-Pierre, you know, the one who brings the night meals. He was muttering about bread prices and angry crowds. The common folk are hungry, it seems. A new voice joined our conversation. Faint but clear enough, it's more than hunger. This was Lambert, 3 cells down, a former lawyer whose expertise in constitutional matters had proven inconvenient to the king's ministers. My guard let slip that the king has called in troops, soldiers in Paris. Never a good sign. A murmur ran through the cells then, a ripple of whispers and speculation. It was rare for so many of us to speak at once. The guards usually discouraged such communication, seeing it as the first step toward conspiracy or rebellion. But today their attention seemed to be elsewhere. From far above, a new sound joined the chorus, a soft rhythmic tapping. It was Abbe Fournier, communicating in the code we had developed over years of imprisonment. 1 tap for A, 2 for B, and so on. It was slow, but it allowed for conversations that the guards couldn't understand. I listened carefully, translating in my mind. Paris, Rises. Paris rises. My heart quickened at the message. What did the old priest know that we didn't? Fournier had been here even longer than the Comte, arrested for writings that questioned the divine right of kings. But he had a way of knowing things, as if the very walls whispered secrets to him. I tapped back. W-H-E. The reply came swiftly. N-O-W. Now, the word hung in the air, pregnant with possibility. Could it be true? Was Paris truly rising against the king? And if so, what would it mean for those of us forgotten in the Bastille? Michel's song had stopped, and I realized all the prisoners had fallen silent, listening to the exchange between Fournier and myself. When the tapping ceased, a different kind of silence fell, not the resigned quiet of routine, but the tense stillness of anticipation. It was broken by a distant shout, followed by the sound of running feet. The guards were agitated about something. "Do you hear that?" Durand asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to catch any sound from outside. Beyond the usual noises of the prison, beyond the rain that still fell steadily, there was something else, a distant rumble like thunder, but not from the sky. "People," Lambert said, his voice filled with wonder. "That's the sound of people." I closed my eyes, focusing on the sound. He was right. It was the murmur of a crowd, far away but growing louder. The sound of Paris, awakening from its long slumber. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere down the corridor, wild, almost manic. "They're coming," someone shouted. "God help me, they're finally coming." Quiet. This was a guard's voice, sharp with authority and something else, fear. "The next prisoner who speaks spends a week in the pit." The threat silenced the outward expressions of excitement, but couldn't quell the current of energy that now flowed through the Bastille. I could feel it in the air, in the way the very stones seemed to vibrate with possibility. I returned to my bed, sitting on the edge, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to stop their trembling. After so many years of sameness, of each day bleeding indistinguishably into the next, change was coming. I could taste it in the air, as real and tangible as the bread I had eaten that morning. Above me, the Comte had stopped his pacing. Next door, Durand's cough had quieted. Even Michel's song remained unsung. We were all listening, all waiting. A new sound broke the silence, the tolling of a distant bell, not the measured toll that marked the hours, but an urgent, continuous peal that spoke of alarm. It was joined by another, then another, until the air was filled with their clangor. "The city bells," Lambert breathed. "All of them." I went to my window, standing on tiptoe to peer through the narrow opening. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained dark with clouds. In the distance, I could see smoke rising from several points in the city. "What do you see?" Durand called from his cell. "Smoke," I replied, and I squinted, trying to make out what was happening on the street below. People, many people, moving together. A thrill ran through me, equal parts fear and exhilaration. In all my years in the Bastille, I had never seen such a sight. Paris had always been a distant thing, glimpsed in fragments through my window, a sliver of street, a patch of sky, but now the city seemed to be surging with life, with purpose. They say the people have taken the Invalides. A new voice called out, Antoine, a former soldier imprisoned for striking an officer. That's where the guns are kept. Guns. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. This was no ordinary unrest, no simple bread riot. This was something more. The sounds from the corridor changed. More guards, their footsteps hurried, their voices tense. Orders were being shouted, preparations made. The Bastille, that immovable monument to royal authority, was preparing to defend itself. I pressed my hand against the wall again, feeling the cool stone beneath my palm. How many hands had touched the same spot over the centuries? How many prisoners had waited as I was waiting now for something to change? Durand, I called softly, if it comes freedom, what will you do? There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. Write, he said. Write the truth at last without fear. And you? Lambert asked me. I hadn't allowed myself to consider the possibility. Freedom had been a distant dream for so long that it had taken on the quality of myth. What would I do with it if it came? I think, I said slowly, I would walk, just walk, in the open air under the sky, as far as my legs would carry me. To where? Michel asked, his voice joining our quiet conversation. I smiled, though no one could see it. It doesn't matter, just to be moving, to be choosing my own path. Our whispered dreams of freedom were interrupted by a sound that made us all fall silent, a deep booming noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Bastille. It was followed by another, and another. Cannon, Antoine said, his voice tight with recognition. They're using cannon. The world outside my cell was changing, transforming in ways I could barely comprehend, and we, the forgotten inhabitants of the Bastille, could only wait and listen as our fates were decided by unseen hands. I sat back on my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds of my fellow prisoners, their breathing, their whispered prayers, their muffled sobs of hope surrounded me, a chorus of humanity in the stone tomb. We were not alone, we had never been alone, and perhaps at last, we would not be forgotten. The afternoon light had begun to shift, casting longer shadows across my cell floor. I sat on my wooden stool, idly running my fingers over a groove I'd worn into the table's edge, over countless hours of the same motion. The Bastille had settled into its usual mid-afternoon quiet, that peculiar stillness that descended between the guards' midday rounds and the evening meal. But today, the silence felt different, heavier, expectant. I rose from my seat, drawn once again to the narrow window that was my only glimpse of the world beyond these walls. Standing on tiptoe, I pressed my face close to the opening, feeling the cool stone against my cheeks as I strained to see the sky. Dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, billowing masses of gray and charcoal that swallowed the blue. They moved with purpose, rolling toward Paris like an advancing army. A storm was coming, that much was clear, but something in the air, something in the unusual tension that had gripped the prison all day, told me this was more than just foul weather approaching. There's a storm brewing, I whispered to myself, my breath fogging the stone beside my lips. More than one, perhaps. A distant rumble of thunder answered me, as if in confirmation. I watched as a flock of birds rose suddenly from the rooftops visible from my vantage point, wheeling against the darkening sky before disappearing from view. Even they sensed the change coming. The wind picked up, sending a cool draft through my window. I closed my eyes, savoring the fresh air against my face, a small luxury in this place of stale breaths and damp stone. The scent it carried was complex, the metallic tang of approaching rain, but also smoke from the city's chimneys, and something else, something acrid and unfamiliar. Opening my eyes, I noticed movement below. From my limited view, I could see people in the streets moving with unusual haste. Not the regular bustle of daily commerce, but something more urgent, more purposeful. A man ran past, looking over his shoulder. A woman hurried children indoors. A cart loaded with what looked like barrels rumbled by, moving against the flow of foot traffic. The guards had been agitated all day, their footsteps quicker in the corridors, their voices lower but more frequent. Twice I'd heard the main gate creak open and shut again, the sound echoing through the fortress in a way that suggested urgency rather than routine. I stepped back from the window, my mind working to piece together these fragments of observation. In my years of imprisonment, I'd become attuned to the rhythms of the Bastille, to the patterns of life within its walls. Today, those patterns had shifted. Returning to my table, I picked up the small piece of charcoal I'd managed to salvage from my last fire ration. I'd been using it sparingly, marking the passage of days on the underside of my table where the guards wouldn't notice. But today, I felt compelled to write something else. On the rough stone wall, in a spot that would be shadowed when the guards made their evening inspection, I wrote the date, July 14th, 1789, and beneath it a single word, change. Another roll of thunder, closer now, vibrated through the stones of my cell. The storm was approaching rapidly, the wind whistling more insistently through my window. I returned to my observation post, watching as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, striking the courtyard stones with audible impacts. But it wasn't just rain falling from the sky that drew my attention. There were papers, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, carried on the wind, swirling and dancing in the gusts. Pamphlets or broadsides, by the look of them, though I couldn't make out the words from my height. They fluttered like pale birds against the dark sky before settling on the wet cobblestones below. A shout carried to me on the wind, angry, defiant, then another, and another, until they blended into a distant chorus that rose and fell like the thunder itself. The people of Paris were raising their voices, and even through the thick walls of the Bastille, I could hear their fury. The rain came harder now, a proper downpour that drummed against the stones and formed rivulets down my window slit. I watched the water stream past, distorting my already limited view of the world outside. Through the watery veil, the streets seemed to be filling with people, dark shapes moving with purpose through the rain. A particularly brilliant flash of lightning illuminated my cell for a brief moment, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, nature's fury matching what appeared to be brewing in the streets below. I sank down onto my bed, my heart beating faster than it had in years. Something was happening, something significant. Renard's words from days ago echoed in my mind. There are those who say change is coming. Was this it? Was this the change he'd spoken of? The cell door rattled suddenly, making me start. A key turned in the lock, not the usual measured movement of the regular guards, but something hurried, almost frantic. The door swung open to reveal Renard himself, his face pale, his usually neat uniform disheveled. "The city is in uproar," he said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "The people are marching." I stood slowly, uncertain of his purpose in telling me this. "Marching where?" I asked, my voice rough with disuse. Renard's eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I'd never expected to see in a guard of the Bastille. "Here," he said simply. "They're marching here." Before I could respond, a commotion erupted somewhere in the depths of the prison. Shouts, the sound of running feet, the clang of metal. Renard glanced over his shoulder, his hand tightening on the door. "I shouldn't be telling you this," he muttered, seemingly more to himself than to me. "But you've been here longer than most. You deserve to know." He hesitated, then added, "They're saying the people have taken the invalids. They have weapons now." Another crash of thunder punctuated his words, as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging the gravity of the news. The people of Paris, armed and marching on the Bastille. It seemed impossible, yet the evidence of my own senses, the unusual movements, the tension among the guards, the distant shouts carried on the wind, all pointed to something extraordinary unfolding. "What will happen?" I asked, taking a step toward him. Renard shook his head. "I don't know. The governor has ordered us to defend the fortress." But he trailed off, his gaze drifting past me to the window where lightning flashed again. "There are many of them, very many." Another shout from elsewhere in the prison. Closer this time. Renard straightened, his moment of candor passing. "Stay back from the door," he said, his voice regaining some of its official sternness. "Whatever happens, stay in your cell." With that, he withdrew, closing and locking the door behind him. I stood motionless in the center of my cell, my mind reeling from the encounter. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the walls, wind howling through every crack and crevice of the ancient fortress. But it was the storm of human making that truly held my attention now. Moving back to the window, I pressed myself against the opening, straining to see through the curtain of rain. The streets below were definitely filling with people now, dark masses moving like storm clouds themselves. And they were indeed moving toward the Bastille, their collective purpose evident even from my limited perspective. Something struck the outer wall with enough force that I felt the impact through the stones, a small tremor that ran through the very foundation of the fortress. What was happening out there? Were they attacking already? I pulled away from the window, my hands shaking with a strange mixture of fear and excitement. For years the Bastille had been my prison, my tomb. I had resigned myself to dying within these walls, forgotten by the world outside. Now the world was at the gates, demanding entry. The storm raged on, both outside and within me. Rain continued to pour, thunder crashed overhead, and lightning cast brief, stark illuminations across my cell. Each flash revealed the same sparse furnishings, the same damp walls that had been my companions for so long. But somehow they looked different now, less permanent, less absolute. I returned to my charcoal marks on the wall, tracing my fingers over the date I'd written. July 14th, 1789. A day like any other when I'd awakened this morning. But now, as the twin storms gathered their strength, one in the heavens, one in the streets of Paris, I sensed it might become something more. A day of change indeed. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands clasped between my knees to still their trembling, and listened to the symphony of the storm, rain, thunder, wind, and the growing chorus of human voices rising from below. Whatever was coming, I would meet it as I had met every day in this place, with patience, with resilience. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I also met it with something else: hope. The afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across my cell. I sat on the edge of my pallet, fingertips pressed against the rough stone wall beside me. For hours, I had been listening to the subtle changes in the Bastille's rhythm, the hurried footsteps of guards, the muffled conversations that ceased whenever anyone approached, the unusual tension that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the prison. Something had shifted. I could feel it in my bones, in the air itself. I closed my eyes, focusing on the sounds around me. The usual creaks and groans of the ancient fortress were there. The settling of stones, the distant drip of water from somewhere in the depths of the building. But beneath these familiar noises, something new had emerged. At first, it was barely perceptible, like the hum of distant bees. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew steadily louder. Rising from my bed, I moved to the small window, standing on tiptoe to peer through the narrow opening. The sky had cleared somewhat since morning, patches of blue appearing between the clouds. But my attention was drawn not to the heavens, but to the streets below, to the faint but unmistakable sound rising from the city. Voices, dozens, perhaps hundreds of voices, unified in a distant roar that seemed to roll across Paris like thunder. "What's happening?" I whispered to myself, straining to see beyond the limited view my window afforded. The sound wasn't the usual bustle of the city, the calls of vendors, the clatter of carriages, the general hum of daily life. This was something different, something purposeful, a collective voice, growing stronger with each passing moment. I pressed my ear against the cool stone beside the window, using it to amplify the sounds from outside. The roar ebbed and flowed, like waves against a shore, occasionally rising in what could only be described as a cheer, then falling back into a steady rumble of many voices, speaking as one. My heart quickened its pace. In all my years in the Bastille, I had never heard anything like this. Paris was awake, alive with a new energy that seemed to pulse through the air itself. The sound of my cell door unlocking startled me from my thoughts. I stepped back from the window as the heavy door swung open, revealing Renard's weathered face. His expression was taut, his eyes darting nervously behind him before settling on me. "You hear it?" he asked, without preamble, his voice hushed. I nodded slowly. "What is it? What's happening out there?" Renard entered the cell, closing the door partway behind him, an unprecedented breach of protocol that spoke volumes about the unusual circumstances. "The people," he said simply, as if those two words explained everything, and perhaps they did. "They're gathering at the Hotel de Ville," he continued, referring to the city hall, "demanding bread, demanding justice. The king's troops are there," but he trailed off, shaking his head. "But what?" I prompted, taking a step closer. "But there are too many of them," Renard finished, "and they're not dispersing. Not this time." A chill ran down my spine despite the summer warmth. "Not this time," I repeated softly, the implications of his words sinking in. Renard moved to the window, glancing out briefly, before turning back to me. "The governor has ordered double guards on all gates. He says it's just a precaution, that they'll never come here." There was doubt in his voice, a questioning of authority that I had never heard from him before. "And what do you think?" I asked, watching his face carefully. He met my eyes, and for a moment, the guard and prisoner dynamic between us dissolved. We were simply two men, standing in the shadow of events greater than ourselves. "I think," he said slowly, "that hunger makes men brave, and the people of Paris have been hungry for a very long time." As if to punctuate his words, the distant roar swelled suddenly, loud enough that we both turned toward the window. It was no longer just a sound, it was a physical presence, a force that seemed to press against the very walls of the Bastille. "They're moving," Renard said, his voice barely audible over the noise. "God help us all." With that, he turned and left, securing the door behind him with a finality that seemed at odds with the uncertainty in his eyes. Alone again, I returned to the window, pressing my face against the opening as far as I could manage. The sound was clearer now, unmistakable. A crowd, massive and united, their voices rising together in a tide of anger and determination. And beneath the human voices, other sounds began to emerge, the rhythmic beat of drums, the clatter of makeshift weapons, the distant crack of what might have been gunfire. The city of Paris, which had simmered with discontent for so long, was finally boiling over. I sank back onto my pallet, my mind racing. How many times over the years had I heard whispers of unrest, rumors of discontent, How many times had those whispers faded away, smothered by the king's troops, or dissolved by empty promises? But this felt different. This wasn't just talk, this was action. The Bastille had stood for centuries as a symbol of royal authority, its massive walls and towers a physical representation of the power the monarchy held over the people. To be imprisoned here was to be forgotten, removed from the world on the whim of the king. No trial, no appeal, no recourse, just a letter de cachet with your name, and the gates of the Bastille closing behind you. How many of us were here, scattered throughout the fortress in our separate cells, our separate silences? How many had died here, their names and stories lost to time? And how many people out there, in the streets of Paris, had loved ones who had disappeared behind these walls? The roar grew louder still, no longer distant, but drawing nearer. I could feel it resonating in my chest, a physical sensation as much as a sound. Rising once more, I pressed my palm flat against the wall, feeling the ancient stones vibrate ever so slightly with the force of the sound. Paris was coming for the Bastille. Hours passed, the noise outside steadily growing. The normal routine of the prison had been abandoned. No midday meal had been brought. No guards had made their usual rounds. Instead, there was a frantic energy in the occasional footsteps that passed my door, a tension in the voices that called out orders somewhere in the depths of the fortress. As afternoon deepened toward evening, I became aware of a new sound cutting through the general roar, sharper, more focused, a chant, words repeated over and over with growing intensity. I strained to make out what they were saying, pressing my ear against the window once more. Libérez les prisonniers, free the prisoners. The words sent a shock through me, a jolt of electricity that made my heart stutter in my chest. They were coming for us, not just to attack the symbol of royal oppression, but to free those trapped within it, to free me. After so many years of hopelessness, of resignation to my fate, the possibility of freedom was almost too much to comprehend. I found myself trembling, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps as I tried to process what was happening. The sounds outside continued to grow, the chanting interspersed with cheers and shouts, and then, cutting through it all, a new sound, sharp, definitive, unmistakable. The crack of gunfire, followed by screams. The battle for the Bastille had begun. I paced my cell, 7 steps one way, 7 steps back, as I had done countless times over the years. But now each step was charged with a new energy, a desperate need to know what was happening beyond my walls. The sounds of conflict grew, more gunfire, shouts of command, the occasional deeper boom that might have been a cannon. My cell, which had been my entire world for so long, suddenly felt impossibly small, suffocating in its constraints. I wanted to pound on the door, to shout, to somehow make myself known to the people fighting outside. But years of cautiousness held me back. If the attack failed, if the king's forces prevailed, any prisoner who had shown support for the uprising would face severe punishment. So I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening to the battle rage. The roar of the crowd swelled and receded, punctuated by bursts of gunfire and the occasional cheer. Time seemed to stretch, each minute an eternity, as I strained to interpret the sounds, to determine which side was winning. And then, cutting through the chaos, I heard it, a sound I had never expected to hear within the walls of the Bastille. The splintering of wood, the crash of metal, and a great triumphant cheer that seemed to shake the very foundations of the fortress. The gates had fallen. The distant roar was distant no longer. The people of Paris had breached the Bastille, and their voices now echoed within its walls. The revolution had arrived, and with it perhaps my freedom. The first hint was subtle, a change in the quality of the light, filtering through my narrow window. The usual dim grayness had taken on a peculiar amber hue, wavering and shifting, in a way that sunlight never did. I had been sitting on my pallet, turning over the guard's warning in my mind for what felt like hours, when I noticed it. I rose slowly, my legs stiff from sitting too long in one position. The sounds from outside had been growing steadily throughout the day, distant at first, then closer, swelling like a tide coming in. But this was the first visible sign that something was truly happening beyond these walls. As I approached the window, a faint, acrid smell reached my nostrils. I knew that smell. Every Parisian did. It was the smell of a city burning. Standing on my tiptoes, I strained to see through the narrow slit. The sky had darkened, not with the coming of night, but with smoke. Thick plumes of it rose from somewhere beyond my limited view, curling against the evening sky like ghostly fingers. My heart quickened. Fire, I whispered to myself, the word carrying both fear and something else, a strange exhilaration. Fire was chaotic, unpredictable. It changed things. It destroyed and cleared the way for new growth. And now it seemed fire had come to the Bastille. The first tendrils of smoke began to seep through the cracks around my window, bringing with them that distinctive burning smell. Stronger now. I didn't back away. Instead, I breathed it in, letting it fill my lungs. It stung my throat and made my eyes water, but I welcomed it. This smoke was not from an ordinary fire. This was the smoke of change. I pressed my ear against the wall near the window, listening. The sounds were clearer now. Shouts, yes, but organized shouts, chants, the rumble of many feet, moving together, and beneath it all a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat, the beat of drums, or perhaps the rhythmic striking of weapons against shields. A sudden commotion in the corridor outside my cell drew my attention away from the window. The guards were running. I could hear the frantic pace of their boots on stone, so different from their usual measured tread. Orders were being shouted, voices tight with stress and fear. Secure the armory, man the walls. Where is the commander? No longer the confident barks of men in control, but the desperate cries of those feeling control slip from their grasp. I moved to my door, pressing against it, straining to hear more. The lock had not been designed to keep sound out, merely to keep prisoners in, and through the seams I could catch fragments of hurried conversations as guards rushed past. Hundreds of them, armed with muskets taken from the Invalides, demanding the powder stores. Delaunay refuses to surrender. Each snippet painted a clearer picture of what was happening. The people of Paris had risen, and they had come for the Bastille, not just as a symbol, but for the ammunition stored within its walls. My hands trembled against the rough wood of the door, not with fear but with a wild, unfamiliar hope. The smoke was thicker now, finding its way through every crack and crevice in the ancient stonework. It hung in lazy coils near the ceiling of my cell, transforming the familiar space into something dreamlike and strange. I coughed, covering my mouth with my sleeve, but did not retreat to my bed. Every sense was alert, drinking in the evidence of the world changing around me. A loud boom shook the very foundations of the prison, sending dust and small fragments of stone raining down from the ceiling. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall. Cannon fire. They were using cannon against the Bastille. The thought was almost too incredible to comprehend. For centuries, the Bastille had stood as an immovable fact of Paris life, as permanent as the Seine itself. Kings had come and gone, but the Bastille remained, its 8 towers watching over the city like stern guardians. And now common people, bakers and blacksmiths, merchants and laborers were attacking it with cannon. I laughed, a rusty sound that surprised even me. How long had it been since I had truly laughed? The absurdity and the audacity of it struck me all at once, and I couldn't help myself. I laughed until tears streamed down my face, mixing with those brought on by the smoke. Another boom, closer this time. The stone beneath my feet shuddered. A crack appeared in the wall opposite my door, zigzagging from floor to ceiling like a bolt of lightning frozen in stone. The Bastille was wounded. The unassailable fortress was beginning to crumble. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, still smiling. Whatever happened now, whether the attack succeeded or failed, whether I lived to see the sun rise tomorrow or not, Something had irrevocably changed. The people had remembered their power. The smoke was becoming uncomfortable now, making it difficult to breathe. I tore a strip from my shirt, dampened it in the small bowl of water on my table, and tied it over my nose and mouth. It helped a little, filtering the worst of the acrid fumes. Through my window, I could now see actual flames in the distance, dancing orange tongues against the darkening sky. Were they burning the outer buildings, the guardhouses perhaps, or had the fire spread to the surrounding district? From my limited vantage point, it was impossible to tell. More running footsteps outside, then the unmistakable sound of a key in a lock. Not mine, but close. Another prisoner was being moved. I heard voices, urgent instructions being given. Take him to the North Tower. It's farthest from the fighting. So it had come to that. Not just demonstration or demand, but actual combat. Blood being spilled on both sides. I closed my eyes briefly, offering a silent prayer, not for victory for either side, but for an end. An end to secrets and shadows, to arbitrary power, to men disappearing in the night on the strength of a sealed letter. When I opened my eyes again, the smoke had thickened further, casting a gray veil over everything in my cell. Its softened edges, blurred outlines, made the familiar strange. Like viewing the world through gauze, I made my way back to the window, the damp cloth pressed firmly against my face. The sounds from outside had changed again, less organized now, more chaotic. Individual shouts cutting through the general din, the clash of metal on metal, gunshots, sharp and distinct, and then rising above it all a new sound, a cheer, huge and communal. The roar of hundreds of voices joined in triumph. It rose and fell like a wave, then rose again stronger. Something had happened, something significant. I strained to see, but my window offered only the narrowest glimpse of sky, now heavy with smoke and approaching twilight. But I could feel it, a shift in the very air, as palpable as the smoke that filled my lungs. This was not just a riot or a momentary uprising. This was a turning point. Another crack appeared in my wall, branching off from the first, creating a rough I shape. Small pieces of stone and mortar crumbled to the floor. The Bastille, which had withstood centuries of siege and storm, was yielding to the will of the people. I placed my palm against the wall where the cracks met, feeling the roughness of the broken stone. For so long these walls had been my enemies, unyielding, unchanging, the physical embodiment of my imprisonment. Now, as they began to fail, I felt an odd mixture of satisfaction and something like grief. They had been my constant companions too, in their way. The smoke swirled thicker, and with it came a new smell, gunpowder, sharp and distinct, cutting through the scent of burning wood. Another cheer rose from outside, louder than before, followed by what sounded like hundreds of feet running. Were the attackers retreating or advancing? I pressed my ear against the wall again, listening with every fiber of my being. The sounds were changing, shifting. The rhythmic pounding had stopped. The individual shouts were coalescing into something more uniform, a chant growing louder by the moment. La Bastille est tombée, la Bastille est tombée. The Bastille has fallen. I stepped back from the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. Could it be true? After standing for over 400 years, had the Bastille finally fallen to the people of Paris? As if in answer, a shower of plaster dust rained down from the ceiling as the entire structure shuddered. Not from cannon fire this time, but from something else. From within, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the corridors, doors being broken open, and then I heard it. The sound I had dreamed of for years. Footsteps approaching my cell, not with the measured tread of the guards, but with the urgent pace of purpose. Keys jangling not in the practiced hands of a jailer, but in hands unused to such instruments. The lock on my door rattled. Once, twice, metal scraped against metal as someone struggled with the mechanism, and then with a final defiant groan, the lock gave way. The door to my cell swung open, and through the smoky haze, I saw not the uniform of a prison guard but the rough clothes of a Parisian worker. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes wild with the fever of victory, and in his hand he held not the king's seal, but a simple iron key. "Citizen," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting, "you are free." The voices that had been distant murmurs throughout the morning had transformed into something else entirely. No longer were they whispers carried on the wind or rumors floating through stone. They were here, present, undeniable. I pressed my ear against the cold wall of my cell, my heart pounding in rhythm with what sounded like hundreds of feet upon the cobblestones outside the Bastille. "Liberté," the cry rang out, clear enough now that I could make out individual words. "Liberté, égalité." I stepped back from the wall, a strange trembling taking hold of my limbs. How long had it been since I'd heard such passion in human voices? In the Bastille, emotions were muted, suppressed beneath layers of stone and routine. But these voices, they burned with something I had almost forgotten existed. The small window of my cell faced away from the main entrance, denying me a direct view of what was happening. But the sounds painted a picture vivid enough. The shuffle of countless feet, the occasional metallic clang that might have been weapons, and above all those voices, unified, determined, and growing louder by the minute. I climbed onto my wooden stool, stretching to peer through the narrow slit that passed for a window. The slice of Paris visible to me was in chaos. People ran through the streets, some carrying makeshift weapons, others waving tricolor cockades. In the distance, smoke rose from what I assumed was the Hôtel de Ville. The sky above was heavy with dark clouds, mirroring the tension building below. A sudden crash echoed through the fortress, so powerful it sent vibrations through the stone beneath my feet. I stumbled, nearly falling from my perch. The crowd had struck the outer gates. Another crash followed, and another. Each impact seemed to shake the very foundation of the prison that had stood unassailable for centuries. "They're coming," I whispered to myself, scarcely believing the words even as they left my lips. "They're actually coming." For years I had dreamed of rescue, of liberation, until hope had withered and died within me. Now faced with its possible resurrection, I found myself unsure how to feel. Fear mingled with anticipation, disbelief with desperate longing. The commotion in the corridors outside my cell had reached a fever pitch. Guards shouted orders, their voices tight with panic. Boots pounded on stone as they ran to their posts. Someone was giving orders to prepare for defense, to resist the people at all costs. I sank down onto my bed, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. My hands shook as I pressed them against my face. What would become of us, the forgotten ones, if the Bastille turned into a battlefield? Would we be caught in the crossfire, or worse, executed by desperate guards determined to leave no witnesses? The thought had barely formed when my cell door flew open. Renard stood there, his face pale beneath its weathered tan, keys jangling in his trembling hand. "Get up," he said, his voice rough. "You need to move to the inner chamber. All of you. Governor's orders." I rose slowly, uncertain. What's happening out there? Renard glanced over his shoulder before answering. "The mob has taken the outer courtyard. They've got weapons, muskets, pikes, even cannon they seized from the invalids this morning." He wiped sweat from his brow. "Delaunay is trying to negotiate, but..." He didn't finish the sentence. As he led me from my cell, I noticed other prisoners being gathered in the corridor, haggard men with hollow eyes like mine, blinking in confusion at this disruption of routine. Some I recognized from glimpses during exercise periods. Others were strangers despite our shared imprisonment. "This way," Renard urged, guiding our small group down a narrow passage I had never traveled before. The sounds of the crowd grew louder as we moved, as if we were heading toward rather than away from the commotion. "Surrender the prison," The chant was clear now, resonating through the ancient stones. Release the prisoners. My heart leapt at the words. They hadn't forgotten us. In all the years of my confinement, I had assumed the world outside had moved on, that my name had been erased from memory. But here they were, demanding our freedom. We reached a large chamber deep within the fortress, what appeared to be an old armory now stripped of most weapons. A few guards stood nervously by the door, muskets at the ready. Through a high window, I could see smoke drifting across the sky. "Stay here," Renard ordered, though his authority seemed to be crumbling by the minute. "For your own safety." Before any of us could respond, a tremendous explosion shook the room. Dust and small fragments of stone rained down from the ceiling. One of the other prisoners, an elderly man with a long white beard, fell to his knees in prayer. "They've breached the drawbridge," one guard whispered, his young face drained of color. Time seemed to slow and stretch in that chamber. Minutes became hours as we listened to the battle raging through the fortress. Gunshots echoed, followed by screams. The acrid scent of gunpowder seeped under the door. Occasionally the whole structure would shudder as if some great force was hammering against its walls. I found myself standing beside a man I'd glimpsed over the years but never spoken to. Tall and gaunt, with the refined hands of a scholar. "I've been here for 15 years, he murmured, almost to himself. 15 years without trial, without charge, all for a poem that displeased the king. I nodded, understanding all too well. 10 years for me, for a letter I never even wrote. Around us, other prisoners began to share their stories in hushed tones, as if the possibility of freedom had loosened tongues long held silent. Petty offenses, imagined slights, political disagreements, the supposed crimes varied, but the punishment had been the same for all: disappearance into the Bastille's hungry maw. Another explosion, closer this time, cut our conversations short. The door to our chamber burst open, and Renard appeared again, his uniform torn and dirty, a smear of blood across his cheek. "They've taken the main courtyard," he said, his voice hoarse. "Delaunay has ordered surrender, but some of the Swiss guards are still fighting." His eyes darted between us. "If they break through to this section..." Whatever he meant to say next was lost as shouts erupted just beyond the corridor. The remaining guards exchanged glances, then fled through a side door without a backward look. Only Renard hesitated, his hand on his pistol. "Go," I told him quietly. "You've been kinder than most. Save yourself." For a moment, indecision warred on his face. Then, with a curt nod, he too was gone. Left alone, we prisoners stood in uncertain silence. Freedom seemed tantalizingly close, yet none of us moved. What waited beyond these walls? What world would we find after years, decades for some, of isolation? The door burst open once more. I flinched instinctively, expecting armed guards or angry revolutionaries. Instead, a young man stood there, barely more than a boy. His clothes were those of a common laborer, his face smudged with gunpowder and sweat, but his eyes burned with a fierce light. "The Bastille has fallen," he announced, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're free. Free." The word hung in the air, almost incomprehensible after so long. The boy stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. "Come. The people are waiting." One by one my fellow prisoners moved forward, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. I remained rooted in place, overwhelmed. Freedom had been a dream for so long that facing its reality was almost too much to bear. The young revolutionary approached me, concern crossing his face. "Monsieur, are you hurt?" I shook my head slowly. No, I'm not hurt." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. I had forgotten what hope feels like." He smiled then, offering his arm for support. "Come, citizen. A new France awaits you." I took a deep breath and moved forward on unsteady legs, allowing him to guide me toward the door. The corridor beyond was filled with smoke and debris, evidence of the fierce battle that had raged through the fortress. In the distance, I could hear cheering, singing, the sounds of celebration rising above the Bastille. As we approached another doorway, the revolutionary paused. "Prepare yourself," he warned gently. "The world has changed while you've been within these walls." I nodded, my throat too tight for speech. Together we stepped forward, toward the sounds of revolution, toward whatever new beginning awaited beyond the crumbling walls of my long confinement. The shouts of the revolution called to me, no longer muffled by stone and despair, but clear and bright with promise. For the first time in a decade, I walked toward freedom, one uncertain step at a time. I pressed my ear against the cold stone wall of my cell, trying to make sense of the chaos that had erupted around me. For hours, the rumble of the crowd outside had grown from a distant murmur to a deafening roar, and now came the sounds I had both feared and hoped for. The first gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, making me flinch even within the thick walls of my prison. Then another, and another. Each report echoed through the ancient corridors of the Bastille, bouncing off stone and iron until it seemed the very air was filled with the sound of violence. "My God," I whispered, backing away from the wall. "It's really happening." I had known something was brewing for days. The guards had been tense, their conversations hushed, their movements hurried. Food had come irregularly, sometimes not at all. But this was beyond anything I had imagined during my long years of captivity. The floor beneath my feet trembled slightly, and dust sifted down from the ceiling like fine snow. Something had struck the fortress, something heavy, powerful, a cannon perhaps. The thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence shook the stones around me. I staggered to my window, stretching on tiptoe to peer through the narrow slit. From my limited vantage point, I could see only a slice of sky, now hazed with smoke, and the top of one of the Bastille's towers. But even that restricted view told a story. Figures moved along the ramparts, guards rushing to defensive positions. One fell suddenly, clutching his chest, and disappeared from my sight. "They're dying out there," I murmured, a complex mix of emotions churning within me. These were the men who had been my captors, who had controlled every aspect of my existence for years. Yet they were also the men who had brought me food, who had occasionally shared a kind word or a piece of news. Renard, with his gruff manner, hiding a surprisingly gentle heart. Young Dupont, who sometimes slipped me an extra crust of bread. Were they among those fighting or falling on the walls? Another impact shook the building, stronger this time. Small fragments of mortar crumbled from between the stones of my cell. The Bastille had stood for centuries, a symbol of royal authority and oppression. I had never imagined I would live to see it under attack, its impregnability challenged by the people of Paris. The clash of steel reached my ears, swords meeting in desperate combat. Shouts and screams followed, some in pain, others in fury or triumph. The noise was overwhelming after the years of relative silence I had endured. I covered my ears for a moment, then forced my hands back down. This chaos, this violence, it was terrible, yes, but it was also the sound of change coming at last. I moved to my door, pressing against it, feeling the solid wood beneath my palms. For so long, this door had been the boundary of my world, the impassable barrier between captivity and freedom. Now, with battle raging outside, I wondered, could today be the day it finally opened? As if in answer to my unspoken question, a key rattled in the lock. I stepped back hurriedly as the door swung open to reveal Renard, his face streaked with sweat and grime, his uniform disheveled. "Monsieur," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "You must stay back from the windows. It isn't safe." "What's happening?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Who's attacking?" Renard glanced over his shoulder before answering. "The people. They came first for gunpowder. But now," he broke off as another impact shook the building. "Now they want the Bastille itself." "Why?" I pressed, desperate for information after so long in isolation. "Revolution," he said simply, the word hanging in the air between us like something tangible. "Paris has risen. The king's authority is crumbling, and the Bastille," he gestured at the walls around us. "The Bastille is the symbol of everything they hate." Before I could respond, a tremendous crash echoed through the fortress, followed by cheers so loud they penetrated even the thick walls of my cell. Renard's face paled. "They've breached the outer courtyard," he said. "I must go. Stay away from the door and windows. I cannot guarantee your safety. If..." He stopped, perhaps realizing the futility of such warnings now. With a nod that might have been farewell, he pulled the door shut again, though I noticed he did not lock it this time. I stood staring at the unlocked door, hardly daring to believe what it might signify. Freedom? After all these years? The thought was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. Another volley of gunfire brought me back to the present. The battle was still raging, and an unlocked door was meaningless if I could not safely leave my cell. I sank down onto my bed, hands clasped between my knees, and waited. Time passed strangely, as the sounds of combat continued. The light from my window shifted, telling me that hours were passing, though it felt both longer and shorter than that. The noise would occasionally diminish, giving me hope that the fighting had ended, only to surge again with renewed intensity. The walls of my cell, which had been my entire world for so long, now seemed fragile, vulnerable. Each impact, each distant explosion, sent tremors through the stone that I could feel through the soles of my feet. Dust continued to drift down from the ceiling, coating my hair and shoulders with a fine gray powder. I found myself thinking of the Bastille's other prisoners. Were they too sitting in their cells, listening to the battle that might determine their fate? Some had been here even longer than I had, their crimes, or alleged crimes, long forgotten by all but themselves, would today bring change for them as well. The quality of light from my window was beginning to soften, indicating the approach of evening, when a new sound reached me, the splintering of wood, the crash of furniture being overturned, and voices, many voices inside the fortress now, not just outside. The outer defenses had fallen. The Bastille was being overrun. I rose to my feet, drawn irresistibly to the door. With a trembling hand, I pushed against it, and it swung open easily. The corridor beyond was empty, but echoing with distant shouts and the sound of running feet. The guard post at the end of the hallway stood abandoned, the chair overturned, papers scattered across the floor. I took one step out of my cell, then another, my heart hammering in my chest. The stones felt different beneath my feet, now that I walked them as a man potentially free rather than irrevocably imprisoned. The air itself seemed changed, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. A sudden burst of gunfire from somewhere above made me flatten myself against the wall. The battle was still being fought, even as parts of the fortress fell to the revolutionaries. I was caught in between, no longer securely a prisoner, not yet safely free. "Hello?" I called out, my voice weak and uncertain after years of disuse. "Is anyone there?" Only the sounds of distant fighting answered me. I was alone in this part of the Bastille, at least for now. The realization was both frightening and liberating. For the first time in years, no eyes watched me, no guards monitored my movements. I could go where I wished, if I dared. Another heavy impact shook the building, and a crack appeared in the ceiling above me, zigzagging across the ancient stones like lightning frozen in time. The Bastille was wounded, its centuries-old invulnerability finally breached, and like a wounded beast, it seemed to shudder around me. I began to move down the corridor, one hand trailing along the wall for support, my legs unsteady after so long confined in a small space. Each step was a victory. Each yard covered a triumph over the years of immobility. The corridor opened onto a wider hallway, and I saw signs of hasty departure. A guard's hat discarded on the floor, a ring of keys dangling from a lock. The sounds of fighting grew louder as I ventured further. Shouts and cries, the report of muskets, the clash of steel on steel, the symphony of battle surrounded me. Yet I kept moving, drawn forward by a force I couldn't name. Perhaps it was simple curiosity after so long seeing only the same four walls. Perhaps it was the pull of freedom, still uncertain but now tantalizingly possible. I rounded a corner and stopped short. A body lay sprawled on the stone floor, a guard, his uniform stained dark with blood. I had not seen death in many years, and the sight shocked me, a stark reminder of the violence that was the midwife to change. Stepping carefully around the fallen man, I continued on. The corridors of the Bastille formed a labyrinth, and more than once I found myself disoriented, unsure which way would lead to freedom, and which deeper into the fortress. But always I moved toward the sounds of fighting, instinctively understanding that there lay the path to the world outside. As I climbed a narrow staircase, the walls around me shuddered again. This time the impact was closer, more immediate. Stones shifted, and dust clouded the air. For a moment I feared the staircase itself might collapse, trapping me in the rubble of the falling Bastille. But though it swayed, it held, and I continued my ascent. At the top of the stairs, a door stood ajar, and through it came the fading light of day, and the full cacophony of battle. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my ears nearly as loudly as the gunfire beyond. Through the gap I could see a section of the inner courtyard, where a desperate struggle was unfolding. Guards and citizens clashed in chaotic combat. Men in the uniforms of the French Guard, the king's own soldiers, fought alongside common people armed with muskets, pikes, and makeshift weapons. The stones were slick with blood, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder, and I stood on the threshold watching history unfold before my eyes, knowing that whatever happened next would shape not just my fate, but the fate of France itself. I stood frozen in my cell, my heart pounding against my ribs like a desperate creature seeking escape. The sounds from beyond my door had transformed, no longer the measured footsteps of guards making their rounds, but the chaotic scramble of men in retreat. The Bastille, that immovable monument to royal power, was trembling. "My God," I whispered, the words escaping my lips like a prayer. "Is it truly happening?" For hours I had listened to the crescendo of battle, the thunder of cannons, the crack of muskets, the roar of voices united in rebellion. But this was different. This was the sound of order collapsing, of authority in flight. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to capture every nuance of the commotion outside. The corridor echoed with shouts, not commands but warnings. "They've breached the outer wall. The governors surrendered. Save yourselves." Footsteps pounded past my door, growing fainter with each passing moment. The guards, my jailers for countless years, were abandoning their posts. The realization washed over me like a wave, leaving me lightheaded and trembling. I stumbled back from the door, my legs suddenly weak. My narrow cot caught me as I fell, the thin mattress offering little cushion against the frame beneath. I sat there, hands pressed against my face, feeling the rough stubble of my beard, the deep lines etched by time and sorrow. The air in my cell seemed to change, becoming lighter somehow, as if the very atmosphere recognized the momentous shift occurring within these stone walls. I drew a deep breath, tasting something unfamiliar mixed with the usual mustiness possibility. A strange calm settled over me then, despite the chaos erupting throughout the fortress. I lowered my hands and looked around the small space that had been my world for so long. The damp stone walls with their patient trickle of moisture, the scratched table where I had taken countless lonely meals, the narrow window that had framed my only view of the sky. Would I truly leave this place? After all these years, could freedom be more than just a dream that tormented my sleep? The sounds of battle continued to filter through the walls, but they seemed distant now, as if happening in another world. In my cell, time slowed to a crawl. I rose from my cot and moved to the small table, running my fingers over the marks I had carved to count the days until I had lost the will to continue counting. How many years? 7? 8? The seasons had blurred together, marked only by the changing quality of light through my window and the varying degrees of dampness in the air. I reached for the loose stone in the wall where I kept my few treasures, a worn wooden cross, a scrap of paper with my daughter's name written in fading ink, a small piece of red ribbon that had once belonged to my wife. I clutched them in my palm, these fragments of a life I had almost forgotten. A new sound interrupted my reverie, a metallic scraping followed by a heavy thud, then another and another. The locks of the cells were being broken, not just mine but all of them. The realization sent a jolt through my body. Voices called out in the corridor, unfamiliar voices filled with urgency and purpose. Check every cell. The prisoners must be freed. Hurry before reinforcements arrive. I moved to the door, my heart racing once more. Should I call out, or remain silent, hidden in the shadows of my cell? After so many years of forced silence, the thought of raising my voice seemed almost blasphemous. Before I could decide, the sound of metal striking metal rang out just outside my door. The lock groaned in protest, then gave way with a screech that seemed to echo the death cry of the old order itself. The door swung open and light flooded in, not the pale, filtered light I was accustomed to, but the golden glow of torches held high by men whose faces were flushed with exertion and triumph. "Here's another," called the man at the front, a burly fellow with a smith's hammer still clutched in his hand. His clothing was simple, the garb of a working man, but he stood with the bearing of a conqueror. "Come, citizen, you're free." I didn't move, couldn't move. The word free hung in the air between us, too enormous to comprehend. The man's expression softened as he took in my hesitation. "How long have you been here, old friend?" I opened my mouth, but no sound emerged. How long indeed? I cleared my throat and tried again. "Since the winter of '81, I managed, my voice rough from disuse. The man's eyes widened and he exchanged glances with his companions. 8 years, he said softly. Then with more force, 8 years stolen from you. But no more. The Bastille has fallen. The people of Paris have risen. He extended his hand, call used and strong. I stared at it, this simple human gesture that had been denied to me for so long. Slowly I reached out, my own hand pale and trembling by comparison. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid. "Come," he said again, "a new France awaits." I took one step forward, then another. Each movement felt unreal, as if I were walking in a dream from which I would soon awaken. But the hand holding mine was real, as was the corridor beyond my cell door, a corridor now bustling with strangers in common clothing, moving from cell to cell, breaking locks and calling out words of liberation. Other prisoners emerged from their cells, blinking in the unaccustomed light. Some wept openly, others laughed, the sound rusty and strange. A few seemed unable to comprehend what was happening, standing motionless in their doorways like statues carved from the same stone as the Bastille itself. "What day is it?" I asked as my rescuer led me toward the main staircase. "July 14th, he replied. "A day that will be remembered for centuries to come." July 14th. I turned the date over in my mind, committing it to memory. The day the impossible happened. The day the Bastille, symbol of royal tyranny, keeper of secrets, swallower of lives, fell to the people of Paris. We descended the stairs, our footsteps joining the cacophony that filled the fortress. The smell of smoke grew stronger, mingling with the metallic scent of blood and the sweat of exertion. Evidence of the battle was everywhere. Splintered wood, broken weapons, and here and there the still forms of those who had fallen in the fight. I averted my eyes from the dead, focusing instead on the living stream of humanity that flowed through the corridors. Men and women of all ages moved with purpose, their faces alight with the fervor of revolution. Some carried weapons, pikes, muskets, even kitchen knives tied to broomsticks. Others bore torches, their flames casting dancing shadows on the ancient stones. "Watch your step," my guide cautioned as we navigated a section of corridor where the flagstones were slick with water from a broken pipe. The fighting damaged some of the structure. I nodded, though the warning was unnecessary. After years of moving through my cell in near darkness, my feet had developed an acute sensitivity to the surfaces beneath them. As we approached the main courtyard, the sounds of celebration grew louder: cheers, songs, the rhythmic chanting of slogans I didn't recognize. The air grew fresher, carrying the scent of gunpowder and summer heat. "Are you ready?" my companion asked, pausing at the threshold of a massive doorway. Was I ready? How could anyone be ready for rebirth after so long in the tomb? I clutched my small treasures tighter in my palm and nodded. We stepped through the doorway and the courtyard of the Bastille opened before me, a space transformed from military precision to revolutionary chaos. Hundreds of people filled the area, some tending to the wounded, others embracing former prisoners, still others beginning the work of dismantling the fortress stone by stone. The sky above was open and vast, no longer framed by the narrow confines of my window. I tilted my head back, drinking in the expanse of blue dotted with clouds. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard. "Breathe it in," said my guide, watching me with a smile. "That's the air of liberty." I did as he suggested, filling my lungs with the warm summer air. It tasted of dust and smoke and something else, something I had almost forgotten: hope. Movement caught my eye, a group of men approaching the main gate, carrying something between them. As they passed, I saw what it was: the head of the governor mounted on a pike. I turned away, my stomach churning. Revolution, it seemed, had a price paid in blood. Not a pretty sight, my companion acknowledged, following my gaze, but necessary. The old world must die for the new one to be born. I wasn't sure I agreed, but I said nothing. What did I know of the world outside these walls? What right had I to judge the methods of those who had won my freedom? Instead, I asked, "What happens now?" He smiled, gesturing toward the gate that led to the city beyond. Now you walk out those gates. You return to life, and France, all of France, begins anew." The gates stood open, a sight I had never expected to see. Beyond them lay the streets of Paris, filled with more people than I could count, all surging toward the fallen fortress, drawn by the news of its fall. I took a step forward, then another, my rescuer at my side. Each movement brought me closer to that open gate, to the threshold between captivity and freedom. My heart raced, not with fear now, but with a wild anticipation that bordered on terror. What waited for me beyond those gates? My family, if they still lived. A city transformed by revolution. A future I could scarcely imagine. I didn't know, but for the first time in 8 long years I would have the chance to find out. The chains of the Bastille had broken, and with them, the chains that had bound my soul. The tension had been building all day, a crescendo of rage and hope that even the thick walls of the Bastille could not muffle. I had been pacing my cell for hours, 7 steps one way, 7 steps back, listening to the chaos unfold. The distant roars had grown closer, more organized, more purposeful. They were not just angry voices anymore. They were battering rams and musket fire, determination and revolution. A tremendous crash echoed through the fortress, vibrating the very stones beneath my feet. I froze mid-step, my heart hammering against my ribs. That was no thunder, no cannon fire. That was the sound of the unthinkable, the outer gates giving way. I rushed to my cell door, pressing my ear against the rough wood. The usual disciplined footsteps of the guards had been replaced by frantic movement, shouted orders drowned out by the din from outside. For a moment I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of the cacophony. The Bastille had stood for centuries, an immovable monument to royal authority, and yet today it trembled. There through the first courtyard, the voice belonged to one of the younger guards, high-pitched with panic. God help us, they've taken the drawbridge. Another crash. Closer now, sent dust sifting down from the ceiling of my cell. I stepped back from the door, watching the fine powder dance in the narrow shaft of light from my window. How many times had I stared at that beam of sunlight, my only connection to the world beyond these walls? How many times had I traced its slow journey across my cell floor, counting the hours of another endless day? And now, that world was forcing its way in. The sounds outside my cell door grew more chaotic. Boots on stone, the jangle of keys, the metallic rasp of weapons being drawn. I could hear the fear in the guards' voices, could almost smell it mingling with the ever-present damp of the prison. What about the prisoners? Someone asked. The reply was lost in another deafening crash that seemed to shake the entire building. I moved to my small window, standing on tiptoe, as I had done countless times before, straining to see what little I could of the world outside. Smoke rose in dark columns against the summer sky, and the air carried the acrid scent of gunpowder. Paris was burning, and the flames had finally reached the Bastille. A series of sharp cracks echoed through the air. Musket fire, closer than before. The revolutionaries had breached another barrier. I could hear shouts now, not just the disciplined commands of soldiers, but the raw, powerful voice of the people. They called for freedom, for justice, for the heads of tyrants. And then came a sound unlike any I had heard before. A roar of triumph from 100, no, 1,000 throats, followed by an ominous splintering of wood. The main gates, the last physical barrier between the mob and the interior of the fortress. I staggered back from the window, my legs suddenly weak. After all these years, could it truly be happening? I had forgotten how to hope, had trained myself not to dream of freedom. It was easier that way, less painful. And yet now, with each crash and shout, with each tremor that ran through the ancient stones, something long dormant stirred within my chest. The floor beneath me shuddered as if the Bastille itself were drawing a ragged breath. Then came a sound so tremendous, it seemed to split the air. The unmistakable groan of centuries-old wood, giving way. The shriek of metal twisting beyond its limits. The thunder of the final gates crashing down. For a heartbeat, silence fell. A silence so complete, it rang in my ears. And then chaos. The stillness shattered into 1,000 pieces, as a wave of humanity poured into the fortress. Their footsteps echoed like drum beats, their voices rising in a symphony of liberation and vengeance. The sound washed over me, through me, filling every crack and corner of my cell, of my being. The keys, someone shouted. Find the keys to the cells. I pressed myself against the wall beside my door, heart pounding so hard I feared it might burst from my chest. The corridor outside had become a battlefield. The slap of feet on stone, the clash of weapons, cries of pain and fury. I could not tell which sounds came from guards and which from revolutionaries. In the storm that was breaking over the Bastille, such distinctions no longer seemed to matter. A body slammed against my door, making me jump. The wood groaned but held firm. The impact came again, deliberate this time, accompanied by voices. "There are prisoners here. This one's locked. Stand back, stand back." I retreated to the far corner of my cell as something heavy, an axe, or a pike perhaps, began to splinter the door from the outside. With each blow, chips of wood flew inward, spinning through the dim air of my prison. Light from the corridor began to filter through the growing holes, not the pale, distant light of my window, but the warm golden glow of torches carried by free men. The attack on my door paused, followed by the jangling of keys and a muffled curse. Metal scraped against metal as someone tried various keys in the lock. I held my breath, unable to move, unable to think beyond this moment that hung suspended between my past and whatever lay beyond that failing door. The lock gave way with a solid click that seemed to echo in my bones. For a second, nothing happened. Then slowly, so slowly it might have been a dream, the door began to swing open. Light flooded my cell, harsh, beautiful light that made me shield my eyes with a trembling hand. In the doorway stood figures, silhouettes against the glare, common men with uncommon purpose, their clothes stained with sweat and soot, their faces flushed with exertion and triumph. They carried an assortment of weapons, muskets, pikes, even kitchen knives, and wore the determined expression of those who had decided their fate would no longer be dictated by others. One man stepped forward, a burly fellow with a blacksmith's arms and a tricolor cockade pinned to his cap. His eyes widened as they adjusted to the dimness of my cell, taking in my ragged appearance, the Spartan furnishings, the years of confinement etched into every line of my face. "How long have you been here, citizen?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. I opened my mouth, but no sound emerged. How long indeed? The days had blurred into months, the months into years, until time itself lost all meaning within these walls. "Too long," I finally managed, my voice a dry whisper. The man nodded, understanding in his eyes. He extended a calloused hand toward me, a simple gesture that bridged the chasm between imprisonment and liberty. "France is changing," he said. "The Bastille has fallen. You're free. Free." The word fell on my ears like rain on parched earth. I stared at his outstretched hand, unable to move. Freedom was a country whose language I had forgotten how to speak, whose customs had become foreign to me, and yet, somewhere deep within, an ember long banked burst into flame. With a hand that would not stop shaking, I reached out and clasped the revolutionary's rough palm. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid and real. "Come," he said, gently pulling me toward the door. "Come and see what Paris has become. Come and help us build what it will be." I took one step, then another, my legs unsteady beneath me. The threshold of my cell, which I had not crossed in years except under guard, lay before me. Beyond it stretched a corridor filled with light and noise and movement, filled with life. I paused at the doorway, turning to look one last time at the space that had been my entire world. The straw pallet where I had slept, and dreamed, and despaired. The table where I had eaten countless tasteless meals. The window through which I had glimpsed fragments of sky. The revolutionary waited patiently, understanding this moment needed its due. Then, with the gentlest of pressures, he guided me forward. I stepped across the threshold, out of my cell, out of the shadows. The corridor was filled with people, prisoners emerging from other cells blinking in disbelief, and citizens of Paris who had stormed the fortress, flush with victory. They moved together now, former prisoners and liberators, toward the broken gates and the world beyond. As I let myself be carried along with this human tide, I caught my first glimpse of what lay ahead through the shattered remnants of the Bastille's main gate. Sunlight, open space, Paris, freedom. The fortress that had stood for centuries as a symbol of oppression had been breached. Its gates had splintered under the determination of the people, and now those same broken gates framed a new beginning, not just for me, but for France itself. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, toward whatever awaited me on the other side. The chaos outside had grown to a deafening roar. For hours, I had pressed my ear against the door of my cell, listening to the sounds of battle rage throughout the Bastille. The guards' shouts had grown more frantic, then more distant, and finally had faded altogether. In their place came new sounds, the triumphant cries of unfamiliar voices, the splintering of wood, the shattering of locks. I sat on my pallet now, knees drawn to my chest, my back against the cold stone wall. The familiar dampness seeped through my tattered shirt, but I hardly noticed it anymore. My heart pounded so violently, I could feel it in my throat, choking me with each beat. After years of sameness, of crushing routine, the sudden upheaval left me paralyzed. What was happening beyond my door? What storm had broken upon the Bastille? The floor beneath me trembled. Dust rained down from the ceiling as something heavy crashed in a distant part of the fortress. I flinched, covering my head with my arms. The sounds were terrifying, yet strangely thrilling. For years, the Bastille had stood impassive, immovable. Now it shuddered and groaned like a dying beast. "They're coming," I whispered to myself, though I wasn't certain who they were. The king's men, come to execute us all before some advancing army. Or was it that army itself, breaking down the walls of my prison? In my isolation, I had heard whispers of unrest, of hunger in Paris, of a people pushed too far. But whispers were all they had been, fragments of rumors carried on the rare breeze that found its way through my window. Another crash, closer now. The shouts were clearer, words distinguishable amid the chaos. "This way, more cells down here. Break the locks, all of them. Freedom, liberty." My breath caught in my throat. These were not the disciplined commands of soldiers. This was the raw, unfiltered rage of the common people of Paris. I rose to my feet, drawn by an instinct I couldn't name. My legs trembled, weak from disuse and fear and something else. Hope, perhaps, that dangerous emotion I had buried deep within me years ago. I approached the door, pressing my palms against the rough wood. It was solid oak, reinforced with iron bands, sealed with a lock that had held firm for all my years of captivity. I had spent countless hours staring at that door, memorizing every grain in the wood, every spot of rust on the metal. It had been my constant enemy, the unyielding barrier between me and freedom. Footsteps approached, many of them running down the corridor outside. I stepped back, uncertain. Should I call out or hide? What awaited me beyond that door, if it should open? A tremendous crash against the wood made me stumble backward. The door shuddered in its frame. Another crash, and another. Metal groaned in protest. "Here, another one here," a voice called, so close it might have been in the cell with me. The next impact sent splinters flying from the door frame. The lock held, but only just. I retreated to the corner of my cell, pressing myself against the wall. My mouth was dry, my heart racing so fast I felt lightheaded. "Stand back," someone shouted. Then came a sound I had never heard before, a sharp crack, followed by a billowing cloud of smoke that seeped under the door. I covered my mouth, coughing as the acrid smell filled my cell. A gunshot. Here, in all my years, the guards had never discharged their weapons within these walls. When the next impact came, the door gave way with a shriek of tearing metal. The lock, which had held firm against my desperate attempts to open it in those first terrible years, was no match for the determined assault from outside. The door swung open, revealing a scene so unexpected I could only stare in mute shock. The corridor beyond was filled with people, not guards in their crisp uniforms, but ordinary men and women. They wore the simple clothes of laborers, shopkeepers, and servants. Some carried makeshift weapons, hammers, kitchen knives, pieces of broken furniture. Others held proper weapons that must have been taken from the guards. Their faces were streaked with sweat and soot, their eyes wild with the fervor of revolution. In the doorway stood a man perhaps a few years younger than myself. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a fresh wound beneath. In one hand, he held a pistol, smoke still curling from its barrel. In the other, he clutched a ring of keys. His face was flushed with exertion, his eyes bright with purpose. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. The revolutionary and the prisoner. I saw in his expression a flicker of shock as he took in my appearance. How must I look to him? Gaunt, gray-haired, dressed in filthy rags, a ghost of a man, forgotten by the world. How long? He asked, his voice hoarse from shouting. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. I cleared my throat and tried again. 17 years, I managed to croak. Or perhaps 18. Something passed across his face, anger, followed by fierce determination. He tucked the pistol into his belt and stepped into my cell. No more, he said simply. He reached out his hand toward me, palm up, fingers extended in a gesture as old as humanity itself. Come, you are free. I stared at his hand, as if it were some strange object I had never seen before. Free, the word had lost its meaning over the years, had become nothing more than a cruel dream that tormented my sleep. How could I be free? The Bastille was eternal, unchanging, impenetrable. And yet, the door stood open, the lock was broken, and this man, this stranger, was offering me a path out. With trembling fingers, I reached out, half expecting my hand to pass through his like a ghost's. But our fingers touched, flesh against flesh, warm and real and solid. His grip was firm as he clasped my hand, strong as he pulled me toward the door. What's happening? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Is it war? Revolution? He replied, his eyes alight with fervor. The people have risen. The Bastille is falling. As if to confirm his words, another tremendous crash shook the building, followed by distant cheering. He tugged at my hand, urging me forward. Come, he said again. There isn't much time. I hesitated at the threshold, suddenly afraid. The cell had been my world for so long. Its dimensions were known, its limitations understood. Beyond that door lay uncertainty, chaos, a world I no longer knew how to navigate. I don't know if I can, I confessed, shame burning in my chest even as I spoke the words. The revolutionary's expression softened. He released my hand, but didn't step away. I understand, he said, and somehow I believed he did. But would you rather die here, when freedom is within your grasp? I looked back at my cell, the straw pallet, where I had spent countless nights, the small table where I had eaten my meager meals, the single window through which I had watched the seasons change. This had been my home, my prison, my entire existence for almost 2 decades. But it was not where I wanted to die. I turned back to the revolutionary, straightening my shoulders despite the pain in my joints. No, I said, my voice stronger now. I would not. He smiled then, a flash of white teeth in his grime-streaked face. Then, take my hand, citizen, and leave this place forever. This time, when he extended his hand, I took it without hesitation. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid, an anchor in the storm of my emotions. With his support, I stepped across the threshold of my cell for the first time in 17 years. The corridor beyond was chaos, people running, shouting, breaking open doors. Other prisoners emerged from their cells, blinking in confusion at their sudden liberation. Some wept openly, others laughed, a sound so foreign in these halls that it seemed to echo strangely against the stone walls. The revolutionary pulled me along, guiding me through the tumult. My name is Etienne, he said as we moved. What shall I call you, citizen? I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again, struck by a sudden realization. For years, I had been nothing but a number to my captors, the name I had been born with, the name I had carried throughout my life before the Bastille had not passed anyone's lips in all that time. Jean, I said at last, the sound of my own name strange on my tongue. Jean Dubois. Etienne nodded, as if affirming my right to reclaim my identity. Well, Citizen Dubois, welcome back to the world. It has changed while you were away, and it is changing still. As we made our way down the corridor, toward whatever lay beyond, I felt something stir within me, a sensation I had thought long dead. It took me a moment to recognize it, so unfamiliar had it become. It was hope. They led me through corridors I had never seen before, past cells whose occupants pressed against the bars, their eyes wide with confusion and dawning hope. The Bastille was transforming around us, no longer a tomb of forgotten souls, but a hive of activity, of shouting voices and running feet. My liberators kept me close, a protective circle of common people with uncommon courage. Mind your step, a woman warned, as we navigated a staircase strewn with debris. She wore a simple dress, stained with what might have been blood, her hair wild around her face. I nodded, unable to form words. After years of speaking to no one but myself and the occasional guard, language felt foreign on my tongue. My legs trembled with each step, weak from confinement and overwhelming emotion. We reached a massive doorway, its heavy wooden doors flung wide. Beyond them lay something I had almost forgotten existed, the outside world. I hesitated at the threshold, suddenly afraid. What awaited me beyond these walls that had defined my existence for so long? Go on, urged a young man beside me, his shirt torn and face smudged with gunpowder. You're free now, free. The word echoed in my mind, beautiful and terrifying. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing the boundary between captivity and liberty. The light hit me like a physical force. I staggered, throwing up an arm to shield my eyes from the brilliance of a July afternoon. After years in the dim confines of my cell, the sun was overwhelming, piercing through my eyelids, even as I squeezed them shut against the glare. Tears streamed down my face, whether from the brightness or the emotion of the moment, I couldn't tell. Slowly, painfully, my eyes began to adjust. Blurred shapes took form around me. Buildings, people, the sky above. Colors flooded in, vibrant and startling, after the muted grays and browns of prison life. The blue of the sky seemed impossibly deep, the red of revolutionary cockades worn by my liberators almost unnaturally bright. I lowered my arm, blinking rapidly as the world came into focus. The Bastille Plaza spread before me, transformed into a scene of chaotic triumph. Hundreds of people milled about, ordinary citizens armed with pikes and muskets, women carrying baskets of bread and bandages, children darting between groups of adults. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and smoke, mingled with the ordinary smells of the city: horse dung, fresh bread, sweat, and perfume. "Are you all right, monsieur?" asked a gentle voice beside me. A young woman offered me a ladle of water from a bucket she carried. Her face was kind, concerned. I reached for it with trembling hands, nearly spilling it in my eagerness. The water was cool and sweet on my parched tongue, nothing like the stale, metallic liquid I had drunk for years. I drank deeply, water dripping down my chin and onto my ragged shirt. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "Thank you." She smiled, patted my arm, and moved on to offer water to others emerging from the fortress. I watched her go, marveling at this simple act of humanity. After so long in a place where such kindness was rare, my feet carried me forward without conscious thought, drawing me further into the plaza. The cobblestones felt strange beneath my feet, uneven, real, alive in a way my cell floor had never been. Each step was a small miracle, a choice made freely. The sounds around me were overwhelming, a cacophony of voices shouting, singing, laughing, crying. Someone nearby played a fiddle, the cheerful tune incongruous against the backdrop of the fallen prison. A group of men worked to dismantle one of the Bastille's smaller towers, the ring of hammers and chisels adding to the din. I turned slowly, taking in the scene in all directions. The fortress that had been my world for so long now stood partially demolished behind me, its once impenetrable walls breached, its towers beginning to crumble. Smoke rose from several points, and the king's flag no longer flew from its highest point. Instead, the tricolor of the revolution fluttered in the breeze. My gaze was drawn upward, past the walls and towers, to the vast expanse of sky above. It stretched endlessly, a canvas of blue painted with wisps of white cloud. How long had it been since I had seen so much sky at once? In my cell, I had treasured glimpses of it through my narrow window, but this boundless blue was almost too much to comprehend. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over me. I swayed on my feet, overwhelmed by sensation and emotion. The world spun around me, too bright, too loud, too vast after years of confinement. My knees buckled, and I would have fallen if not for the strong hands that caught me. "Easy there," said a gruff voice. "You need to sit down." I was guided to a stone bench at the edge of the plaza. The man who had helped me, middle-aged, with a carpenter's caul-used hands, pressed me gently onto the seat. "Take deep breaths," he advised. "It's too much all at once, isn't it? I've seen it before when they release men who've been in prison too long." I nodded, concentrating on my breathing as the world slowly steadied around me. In and out, the simple rhythm of life that continued regardless of prison walls or revolution. "How long were you in there?" the carpenter asked, settling beside me on the bench. "I don't know exactly," I admitted. What year is it now?" 1789, he replied, his eyes softening with pity. "July 14th, 1789. A day that will be remembered," I calculated silently. So many years lost, swallowed by the Bastille's stone throat. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of that lost time. When I opened them again, I looked down at myself for the first time since emerging. My clothes hung loose on my frame, the fabric worn thin and stained. My hands were those of an old man, skin like parchment stretched over bone, nails yellowed and cracked. I touched my face, feeling the deep lines etched by time and hardship, the rough scratchiness of a beard grown wild. "What will you do now?" the carpenter asked gently. The question startled me. What could I do? The world I had known was gone, and I was a stranger in this new Paris, this new France, that was being born in blood and fire around me. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I have nowhere to go." "You have everywhere to go," he corrected me with a small smile. "All of Paris lies before you." He was right, I realized. For the first time in years I could go where I pleased, do what I wished. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. With renewed determination, I pushed myself to my feet. My legs felt stronger now, more steady beneath me. The carpenter stood as well, offering his arm for support. "My name is Marcel," he said. "Marcel Dubois." "Jean-Pierre Beaumont," I replied, the name feeling strange on my lips after so long being known only as the prisoner in cell 14. Marcel nodded. "Well, Jean-Pierre Beaumont, would you like to see what Paris has become while you were away?" I looked around at the plaza once more, at the people celebrating their victory, at the fallen prison, at the open sky above. Something was being born here, something new and unknown, and somehow, impossibly, I was part of it. "Yes," I said, feeling the first genuine smile in years spread across my face. "Yes, I would like that very much." We moved away from the bench, joining the flow of people leaving the Bastille Plaza. As we walked, Marcel pointed out landmarks, explaining how the city had changed. I listened with half an ear, my attention caught by every new sight and sound: a child laughing, a dog barking, the glint of sunlight on a window pane. The streets of Paris opened before us, busy with life and possibility. Each step took me further from my prison, further into this reborn world. The sun warmed my face, a gentle caress after years of darkness. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the air of freedom. Ahead the city awaited, transformed by revolution yet still fundamentally Paris, my Paris, and somewhere in its winding streets perhaps lay the beginning of whatever life remained to me. The future stretched before me, unwritten and mine to claim. I squared my shoulders and walked forward, into the light. I stepped carefully through the broken cobblestones, my prison-weakened legs still adjusting to the freedom of movement. All around me, Paris had transformed into something I scarcely recognized. The streets I once knew, quiet, orderly pathways where the common folk kept their heads down and their voices low, now teemed with life and thunderous sound. This was not the Paris I had been taken from years ago. This was something new, something being born before my very eyes. Make way for the heroes of the Bastille, someone shouted ahead of me, and the crowd parted like water around stone. I moved with the small group of fellow prisoners, all of us still dazed by our sudden liberation. Some wept openly, others laughed with a hint of madness in their voices. I simply walked, drinking in the sights and sounds of a world turned upside down. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and gunpowder, mingling with the everyday smells of the city: fresh bread, horse manure, the river Seine in the distance. My senses, dulled by years of the same damp stone and stale air, now struggled to process this riot of impressions. Each breath felt like my first, burning and sweet in my lungs. Here, citizen, drink. A woman thrust a clay cup into my hands, filled with wine that sloshed over the rim. Her face was flushed with excitement, her cap askew, and her eyes bright with fervor. Drink to the new France. I raised the cup to my lips, the wine sharp and vibrant on my tongue. How long had it been since I'd tasted real wine, not the watered-down swill they served in the Bastille? I couldn't remember. The crowd around me erupted in cheers as I drank, though I was nobody to them, just another freed prisoner, another symbol of the old regime's cruelty. Down with the king, someone shouted, and dozens of voices took up the cry. Down with the aristocrats. I winced, remembering a time when such words would have meant immediate arrest, perhaps even death. Now they rang out freely, bouncing off the walls of buildings where people leaned from windows, waving makeshift flags and calling out to the crowds below. A young man with wild eyes and a musket slung over his shoulder approached me, his face streaked with dirt and what might have been blood. "You were in the Bastille?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. I nodded, still unable to believe it myself. 7 years, I said, my voice rough from disuse and emotion. He clasped my shoulder, his grip firm and warm. "No more," he said simply. "No more secret arrests, no more letters of cachet. The people have spoken." Then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd that surged and flowed like a living river through the streets. I continued walking, my feet taking me instinctively toward the Seine. How many times had I dreamed of seeing the river again, of watching the sunlight play on its surface, of hearing the calls of the boatmen and the splash of oars. Now that dream was within reach, pulling me forward through the celebrating masses. The streets were a chaos of joy and violent energy. People danced in circles, their movements wild and uninhibited. Some wore bits of uniforms or fine clothes, spoils from raided houses or armories. Others carried makeshift weapons, pitchforks, hammers, ancient swords unearthed from family trunks. Children darted between adults, their faces alight with the contagious excitement, too young to understand the full significance of what was happening. I passed a group of men, constructing a barricade, piling furniture, barrels and broken cartwheels into a defensive wall across the street. They worked with grim determination, a stark contrast to the revelry around them. One of them looked up as I passed, his eyes meeting mine. We shared a moment of understanding. This was not just celebration, this was preparation. The night might bring retribution, and they would be ready. At a street corner, a man stood on a crate, reading aloud from a hastily printed pamphlet. His voice carried over the din, pronouncing each word with the precision of someone who had only recently learned to read and treasured the skill all the more for it. The rights of man, he proclaimed. Listen, brothers and sisters, the rights of man, liberty, property, security and resistance to oppression. People gathered around him, nodding and murmuring their approval. I paused to listen, the words washing over me like a baptism. How dangerous these ideas had been, how seditious. Now they were being shouted from the street corners for all to hear. As I continued my journey, I passed a baker's shop with its windows smashed. Inside, people were distributing bread freely, handing loaves to anyone who approached. The baker himself stood in the doorway, his face a complex mixture of fear and resignation. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw in them a question. What would become of him in this new world? I had no answer to give. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cobblestones and painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. The celebration showed no signs of abating with the coming darkness. If anything, it seemed to grow more fervent as torches and lanterns were lit, casting flickering light on faces transformed by passion and possibility. I finally reached the Seine, pushing through the crowd to stand at the stone wall that lined the riverbank. The water flowed below, dark and steady, unchanged by the revolution that boiled through the streets. I leaned against the cool stone, my legs trembling with exhaustion and emotion. Beautiful, isn't it? A voice said beside me. I turned to find an old man, his face weathered by time and hardship, his clothes those of a common laborer. I've lived by this river all my life, he continued, watched it flow under the rule of kings and ministers. And now, he gestured to the city around us. Now we'll see what it looks like when it flows for the people. I nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment. We stood in companionable silence for a time, watching the river and the city beyond. Smoke rose from several points in Paris, dark columns against the darkening sky. The sound of distant gunfire echoed occasionally, a reminder that not all was celebration. You have that look, the old man said finally. The Bastille. Yes, I admitted. Released today. He nodded slowly. My son was taken 3 years ago. No charges, no trial. We never knew where. I'm sorry, I said, the words painfully inadequate. He shrugged, a gesture containing years of grief. Perhaps today he too walks free. Perhaps not. But no more sons will disappear in the night. That at least is something. A sudden commotion drew our attention. A group of men marched down the riverside, carrying something on a pike. As they drew closer, I realized with a jolt of horror that it was a head bloodied and unrecognizable, but unmistakably human. The crowd cheered as they passed, a sound that chilled me despite the warmth of the summer evening. The old man beside me sighed. Revolution has a cost, he said quietly. The question is who will pay it. He touched my arm briefly. Go carefully, citizen. These streets belong to the people now, but the people are not always kind. With a nod of farewell, he moved away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the flowing river. I remained there as darkness fell completely, watching the reflection of torches and fires shimmer on the water's surface. The sounds of Paris washed over me, singing, shouting, the crack of guns, the crash of breaking glass. Birth pangs, I thought, the painful, messy birth of something new. As night settled fully over the city, I finally turned away from the river. My newfound freedom left me without direction, without purpose. Where would I go? What would I do in this transformed world? The questions swirled in my mind as I made my way back into the heart of the city, guided by instinct and the light of bonfires that burned in squares and intersections. The streets of Paris cradled me in their chaos, a bewildering embrace after years of isolation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, but tonight, For better or worse, Paris belonged to the people, and I, somehow, was one of them again. The night stretched before me full of unknowns. As I walked beneath the stars visible in patches between the smoke and buildings, I wondered what dawn would bring to this new Paris, this new France that was being forged in fire and hope.